The Whisper in the Wind. Maplewood, a small town nestled in the rolling hills of Vermont, wore its autumn colors like a crown. The streets were carpeted with red and gold leaves, and the air carried the crisp scent of the season. On Main Street, white picket fences framed neatly kept yards, while smoke curled lazily from brick chimneys. Children laughed as they jumped into piles of leaves, and shopkeepers waved to passers-by. The town looked peaceful, but for 10-year-old Tommy Hawkins, peace was a distant memory. Tommy walked slowly down Cedar Lane, his sneakers crunching against the fallen leaves. He kept his head down, his dark hair flopping over his forehead, and his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. He knew every crack in the sidewalk, every mailbox, and every face in the town. Yet today, those faces looked at him differently, not with kindness, but with the pity reserved for a boy who had lost too much. The iron gates of Maplewood Cemetery creaked as Tommy pushed them open. The path to his mother's grave was well-trodden, a testament to his daily visits. He knelt by her headstone, which gleamed under the midday sun, and traced her name with his fingers. The fresh flowers lying at the base were probably from Mrs. Peterson next door. "Hi, Mom," Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "I miss you." An old man tending a nearby grave gave Tommy a nod of sympathy, but Tommy barely noticed. The world seemed quieter here, as if the cemetery itself understood his grief. After sitting in silence for a while, he rose, brushed off his jeans, and headed toward the community hall. The community hall stood as a proud testament to Maplewood's history. Its weathered red bricks and tall white columns spoke of decades of town meetings, harvest festivals, and celebrations. Tommy loved this place, not for its grandeur, but for the memories it held, especially of his mother. She had once danced with him on this very floor during the annual harvest dance. He could still hear her laughter echoing in his mind. Inside, sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the worn wooden floor with a kaleidoscope of colors. Tommy walked to the back of the hall and sat in one of the old wooden chairs. The beams above him, massive and dark, looked as solid as the foundation of the town itself. He let out a sigh, leaning back as the memories of his mother washed over him. And then he heard it. "The beams will fall." The voice was as clear as if someone had whispered in his ear. Startled, Tommy sat upright, his heart pounding. He scanned the empty hall, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the space was silent and still. "The old timber cannot hold. The hall will collapse." Tommy's hands trembled. The voice wasn't loud, but it was firm, calm yet commanding. It didn't feel like a warning from someone nearby. It felt like it came from everywhere at once. "Who's there?" Tommy called out, his voice shaky. Only the echo of his words replied. Fear and doubt tangled in his mind. Had he imagined it? Was it grief playing tricks on him? He looked up at the beams again. For the first time, he noticed cracks, small but jagged, running through the dark wood like veins. His stomach churned. The voice's warning repeated in his mind, clearer than the day itself. Tommy jumped to his feet and ran out of the hall, the heavy wooden doors slamming shut behind him. He didn't stop until he reached home. "Dad! Dad!" Tommy burst into the living room, where his father, Richard Hawkins, was typing away on his laptop. Richard looked up, startled by his son's urgency. "What's wrong, Tommy?" he asked, setting aside his work. "I was at the community hall," Tommy said, gasping for breath. "I heard a voice. It said the beams are going to fall. The hall will collapse. We have to do something." Richard's expression softened, the way it always did when he thought Tommy was overreacting. "Tommy, slow down. You're not making any sense." A voice. "Was someone there with you?" "No." Tommy shook his head vigorously. "It wasn't like that. It was everywhere. Like God was warning me." Richard frowned, concern flickering in his eyes. "Tommy, I know things have been hard since your mom passed. Sometimes, when we're sad, We can imagine things that aren't real. It's not my imagination, Tommy shouted, his voice breaking. You have to believe me, Dad. We need to warn everyone before it's too late. Richard sighed, leaning back in his chair. Look, Tommy, I'll talk to the mayor tomorrow. I'm sure the hall is fine, but if it'll make you feel better, I'll mention your concerns. Tommy clenched his fists, frustrated by his father's calm dismissal. You don't understand, he muttered, storming off to his room. The next morning, Richard spoke to a few neighbors about Tommy's warning. Most of them responded with kind smiles or gentle pats on his shoulder. Poor kid, Mrs. Peterson said. He's been through so much. It's no wonder he's imagining things. Richard nodded politely but couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something about Tommy's urgency had been genuine. He stopped by the general store to ask Bill Thompson, who had been a carpenter for years, if he'd noticed anything unusual about the hall's structure. Bill shook his head. That building's been standing for over a century. It's solid, Richard. Don't let the boys' worries get to you. But that afternoon, when Richard brought up the matter at the town council meeting, Joe Baxter, the town's chief engineer, agreed to take a look. Can't hurt to check, Joe said. Better safe than sorry. Tommy wasn't convinced. He spent the evening sketching what he had seen in the hall, the cracks in the beams, the places where the wood seemed worn and fragile. His pencil moved feverishly across the paper as if the act of drawing could exorcise the dread building in his chest. When he finally fell asleep, his dreams were filled with images of splintering wood, falling debris, and the panicked cries of townsfolk. He woke in a cold sweat, his mother's voice whispering in his mind. They need to listen, Tommy. The first signs. The morning air was cool and crisp as Tommy stood outside the community hall, his breath forming small clouds. Beside him, Joe Baxter, the town's chief engineer, unloaded tools from the back of his pickup truck. Joe was a tall man with weathered hands and a no-nonsense demeanor. His reputation as a meticulous professional gave the townsfolk confidence in his assessments. Today, he'd brought his clipboard, measuring tools, and a hard hat, which he adjusted with practiced ease. All right, Tommy, Joe said, his tone gruff but not unkind. You said you saw cracks in the beams. Show me where. Tommy nodded, his small hands clutching a folder filled with his sketches. He had spent all night drawing the exact spots where he'd noticed the damage and had marked areas he thought were critical. As they walked into the hall, the heavy wooden doors creaked behind them, amplifying the emptiness of the space. The hall looked almost serene in the morning light. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting multicolored patterns across the floor. The worn wooden chairs were neatly stacked in rows along the walls, and the stage at the far end of the room loomed in quiet authority. But to Tommy, the hall felt ominous, its silence thick with unspoken warnings. Joe started his inspection methodically, tapping the wooden beams with a mallet and shining his flashlight into the dark recesses of the ceiling. Tommy followed closely, pointing out areas of concern. Here, Tommy said, tugging at Joe's sleeve. He pointed to a massive wooden beam running across the ceiling. There are cracks there. Joe tilted his head back, squinting up at the timber. He pulled out a ladder and climbed up, his flashlight illuminating the area Tommy had mentioned. Huh, he muttered under his breath. What is it? Tommy asked, his voice urgent. Joe climbed down and adjusted his hard hat. You've got sharp eyes, kid. There's some surface cracking, but nothing structural. It's just the wood aging. No need to panic. Tommy frowned. But it's not just that beam. Look over there. He pointed to another area above the stage. The voice said the old timber can't hold. You have to check. Joe sighed but obliged, moving his ladder to the stage. He repeated the process, tapping the wood and inspecting it carefully. After nearly an hour, he stepped back, wiping his hands on his jeans. Tommy, he said, crouching down to the boy's level, I've been doing this for 25 years. I know a weak structure when I see one. And this hall is solid. There's no danger of collapse. But Tommy started, his voice trembling. Joe held up a hand. I know you're worried, and it's good that you spoke up. People don't always notice these things, but trust me, this building's been standing for over a century. It's not going anywhere. Later that afternoon, Tommy sat on the steps outside the hall, his folder of sketches lying forgotten beside him. The bright colors of the town seemed muted, and the cheerful chatter of passers-by felt distant. He had thought that bringing Joe Baxter would convince everyone of the danger, but now he felt more alone than ever. Mrs. Linden, the kind elderly woman who lived next door to him, shuffled by carrying a basket of freshly baked muffins. She paused when she saw Tommy's downcast expression. Tommy, dear, she said, her voice warm and gentle. What's troubling you? Tommy hesitated, then explained everything. The voice, the cracks, and Joe's inspection. Mrs. Linden listened patiently, her brow furrowing as he spoke. Well, she said after a moment, Joe Baxter is a good man, but sometimes even the best of us can miss things. Maybe I'll have a word with him myself. Do you believe me? Tommy asked, his eyes wide with hope. Mrs. Linden smiled. I believe you believe what you're saying, and that's enough for me to look into it. Over the next few days, Tommy's warnings became the talk of the town. At the coffee shop, at the grocery store, and even at church, people whispered about the Hawkins boy and his strange premonition. Some dismissed him outright. Kids have wild imaginations. Bill Thompson, the storekeeper, said with a chuckle. He's probably been reading too many ghost stories. Others, like Mrs. Linden, were less certain. That boy has a good heart, she told her knitting circle, and he's sharper than most of us give him credit for. Maybe we shouldn't be so quick to brush him off. But skepticism was louder than belief. Tommy's classmates teased him, calling him the ghost whisperer, and even some adults avoided him. The weight of their doubt pressed on him like a heavy stone. One evening, Tommy had another dream. This time, it was more vivid than before. He stood in the community hall, watching as cracks spiderwebbed across the ceiling beams. The air was thick with the groaning of wood under strain, and then, with a deafening crack, the roof gave way. Debris rained down as people screamed and ran for cover. Tommy tried to shout, to warn them, but his voice was lost in the chaos. He woke with a start, his heart pounding and his sheets damp with sweat. He sat up, clutching his knees to his chest, the images from the dream replaying in his mind. It wasn't just a dream, he told himself. It was a warning. Determined to prove the danger was real, Tommy spent the next day at the library. He pored over old records, blueprints, and renovation reports for the community hall. With the librarian's help, he found a dusty file labeled Structural Assessments. Most of the reports were routine, with notes about minor repairs and maintenance. But one report, dated nearly 20 years ago, caught his attention. Water damage to foundation, it read. Potential risk to structural integrity if left unaddressed. Tommy's heart raced as he read further. The report detailed repairs that were recommended but never confirmed as completed. Why hadn't anyone followed up? He photocopied the report and added it to his growing collection of evidence. This wasn't just about the cracks in the beams. Something deeper, something hidden, was wrong with the hall. That evening, Tommy showed the report to his father. "Dad, look at this," he said, spreading the pages across the dining table. The foundation had water damage years ago. They were supposed to fix it, but there's no record that they did. Richard adjusted his reading glasses, scanning the documents. His brow furrowed. "Where did you find this?" "At the library," Tommy said. "Dad, this is proof. We have to tell everyone." Richard sighed heavily, setting the papers down. "Tommy, you're a smart kid. I'm proud of how hard you're working on this, but sometimes things get written down and forgotten. It doesn't mean the building is unsafe. But it could be." Tommy insisted. "Why won't anyone believe me?" Richard reached across the table, placing a hand on his son's. "It's not about belief, Tommy. It's about evidence. People trust Joe Baxter because he's an expert. If he says the hall is safe, they'll listen to him. That doesn't mean they don't care about what you're saying. Tommy pulled his hand away, frustration bubbling inside him. What if they don't care until it's too late? He stormed off to his room, slamming the door behind him. Richard sat at the table, staring at the old report, a seed of doubt beginning to take root. The gathering storm. The days following Tommy's discovery were a whirlwind of frustration and doubt. Armed with the old structural report, he made copies and began handing them out to neighbors and friends. He approached everyone he could think of. Mrs. Peterson at the bakery, Mr. Green at the grocery store, even Pastor Evans at the church. But no matter how hard he tried, the response was always the same. Kind smiles, vague reassurances, and dismissals that made Tommy feel even smaller. "Tommy," Mrs. Peterson said gently one afternoon, "I know you're trying to help, but we've had that hall for generations. It's a part of this town, and it's as strong as ever." "But what if it isn't?" Tommy pressed. "What if something happens while everyone's inside?" She sighed, patting his shoulder. "Let the adults handle it, dear." Tommy's frustration boiled over as he left the bakery, the bell above the door jingling mockingly behind him. Nobody seemed to care. Nobody wanted to believe him. He felt like a ghost shouting into the void. That night, Tommy sat at his desk, his sketches and reports spread out before him. His small room, lit only by his desk lamp, felt like a tiny island of light in a sea of darkness. He worked feverishly, drawing detailed diagrams of the community hall, highlighting the weak points he'd noticed during his visits. He added notes in the margins: water damage from 2004 report, cracks in primary beam near stage, potential collapse zone. When he finally finished, he leaned back in his chair, his hand aching from hours of work. The drawings were more than just sketches now. They were a blueprint of impending disaster. But how could he make anyone see what he saw? The next morning, Tommy decided to try a different approach. He waited outside Joe Baxter's office, clutching his folder of evidence. When Joe arrived, coffee in hand, Tommy stepped forward. "Mr. Baxter," Tommy began, his voice steady despite his nerves, "I need to show you something." Joe paused, glancing at the boy with a mix of surprise and mild annoyance. "Tommy, I already inspected the hall. We've been through this." "Just 5 minutes," Tommy pleaded, holding up his folder. "Please." With a sigh, Joe unlocked his office door and gestured for Tommy to follow. Inside, the office smelled faintly of sawdust and leather. Blueprints and tools cluttered the desk, and framed certificates lined the walls. Tommy spread his sketches and the old structural report across the desk. He explained everything: the cracks in the beams, the water damage, the voice, and the dreams. Joe listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When Tommy finished, Joe leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Tommy, I'll admit, you've put a lot of thought into this. You've got a sharp eye, and your sketches are impressive. But..." Tommy's heart sank. He knew what was coming. "But there's a difference between noticing something and understanding it," Joe continued. "Cracks in wood are normal. Water damage happens over time. None of this means the building is going to collapse." "But what if it does?" Tommy asked, his voice rising. "What if you're wrong?" Joe sighed again. "Tommy, I appreciate your concern, but I've been doing this a long time. I know what I'm talking about." Tommy gathered his papers, his hands trembling with frustration. "You're wrong," he said quietly. "You'll see." The town's preparations for the fall festival continued in full swing. Strings of lights were hung across Main Street, booths were set up in the park, and the community hall was decorated with orange and yellow banners. The festival was the highlight of the year, and the whole town was buzzing with excitement. But for Tommy, the festivities felt like a countdown to disaster. Every cheerful decoration, every banner, every light strung across the hall's entrance felt like another step closer to tragedy. That evening, Tommy visited Mrs. Linden. Her cozy yellow house smelled of cinnamon and fresh cookies, and her kind smile was a small comfort in the storm of doubt swirling around him. "Tommy, dear," she said, setting a plate of cookies on the table. "You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders." "I do," Tommy admitted, his voice cracking. He explained his frustration, how nobody would listen, and how he didn't know what else to do. Mrs. Linden listened intently, her knitting needles clicking softly as he spoke. When he finished, she reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I believe you, Tommy," she said, "and I think it's time we found someone who can help." The next day, Mrs. Linden made a call to Martin Reed, an architect she knew from a neighboring town. Martin specialized in restoring historic buildings and had a reputation for being thorough and meticulous. When Martin arrived in Maplewood, he met with Tommy and Mrs. Linden at the community hall. Tommy showed him the sketches and explained his concerns, while Mrs. Linden provided the old structural report. Martin was quiet as he examined the beams, his flashlight tracing the cracks Tommy had pointed out. He climbed up to the ceiling, tapping the wood and inspecting the joints. After nearly an hour, he climbed down, his face thoughtful. "You've got a good eye, Tommy," Martin said. "These cracks are more than surface damage, and if this old report is accurate, the water damage could have compromised the foundation." Tommy's heart leaped. Finally, someone believed him. The following evening, Martin presented his findings at a town meeting. The room was packed with residents, their faces a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Martin explained the structural issues he had found and the potential risks of ignoring them. "Based on what I've seen," Martin concluded, "I recommend closing the hall until a full structural inspection can be completed. The risk may be low, but it's not zero." The room erupted into murmurs and whispers. Some residents nodded in agreement, while others shook their heads. Closing the hall during the festival, Bill Thompson scoffed. "That's ridiculous. This is all because of a kid's wild imagination." Someone else muttered. Tommy stood in the back, his fists clenched. Even with Martin's support, the town was divided. But he knew the truth, and he knew he couldn't give up. As the festival approached, tensions in the town grew. Some residents supported Martin's recommendation, while others dismissed it as overreaction. The town council scheduled an emergency vote to decide whether to proceed with the festival in the hall. Tommy watched from the sidelines, his heart heavy. He had done everything he could, but he feared it still wouldn't be enough. That night, as the town debated, Tommy stood outside the hall, staring up at its looming silhouette. The voice returned, clearer than ever. "The beams will fall. The walls will give way. Speak, or they will perish." The turning point. The night of the emergency town council meeting had a different energy than any meeting Maplewood had seen in years. Held in the school auditorium to accommodate the swelling crowd, the room buzzed with heated conversations, worried whispers, and the occasional frustrated shout. On one side of the room sat those who supported Tommy and Martin's warnings. On the other side were those who believed the risk was exaggerated, fueled by a child's imagination. Tommy sat near the back with his father, his folder of sketches and documents clutched tightly to his chest. Richard had been quiet all evening, clearly wrestling with his own doubts. Tommy looked at his father, then at the crowd, his heart pounding. He had never felt smaller. The council members sat at a long table on the stage, their faces a mixture of concern and fatigue. Mayor Thompson stood to address the room, her gavel echoing sharply as she called for order. "We are here tonight to decide whether to proceed with using the community hall for the fall festival," she began. "We've heard concerns from young Tommy Hawkins and architect Martin Reed, but we've also heard reassurances from our chief engineer, Joe Baxter. Tonight, we must weigh these perspectives and make a decision for the safety and well-being of our community." A murmur rippled through the audience. Martin Reed stepped up to the podium, his calm voice cutting through the noise. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've reviewed the hall thoroughly," he said, gesturing to a screen where a slide showed a close-up of one of the cracked beams. While the building is not in immediate danger of collapse under normal circumstances, the increased foot traffic during the festival and the potential vibrations from music, dancing, and large crowds could stress the weakened structure. He clicked to the next slide, showing water damage to the foundation. This old report from 2004 suggests significant water damage to the foundation, which may not have been properly repaired. If that's the case, the stability of the entire building could be compromised. Joe Baxter stood next, shaking his head slightly. "I respect Martin's expertise," he began, his voice steady. "But I've been the chief engineer of this town for 15 years. I've inspected that hall twice, and while I agree it needs maintenance, there's no evidence to suggest it's unsafe for the festival. Closing the hall would be an overreaction." Tawny felt his frustration bubbling over as Joe spoke. It wasn't just the engineer's words. It was the dismissive tone, as if Tommy's concerns didn't matter. As Joe stepped down, Tommy couldn't hold back any longer. "I want to speak." Tommy's voice rang out, surprising even himself. All eyes turned to him. For a moment, his courage faltered, but then he saw Mrs. Linden's warm smile from across the room and Martin Reed's nod of encouragement. He took a deep breath, clutching his folder, and walked to the stage. The microphone seemed far too tall, and Mayor Thompson adjusted it for him. "Go ahead, Tommy," she said, her voice softer than before. Tommy cleared his throat, his small hands trembling as he opened his folder. "I know I'm just a kid," he began, his voice cracking. "But I've seen things. I've heard things. I don't know why, but I just know something's wrong with the hall." He placed his sketches on the table for the council members to see. "These are the cracks I saw in the beams. This is where the water damage is. And here," he pointed to a diagram he had drawn, "this is where the foundation could fail." Tommy paused, scanning the room. "I know everyone thinks I'm imagining this because of my mom. But I'm not. I feel it in my bones. The hall isn't safe." The room was silent as Tommy's words sank in. Then a woman stood in the back, a face Tommy didn't recognize. "I believe him," she said firmly. "If there's even a chance he's right, we shouldn't take the risk." Others began murmuring, some agreeing, others shaking their heads. Richard Hawkins stood up, his voice breaking the tension. "My son has been working tirelessly to warn us," he said, his voice steady. "He may be young, but his concern comes from a place of love for this town. I think we owe it to him to listen." The applause was hesitant at first, then spread through the room. Even those who remained skeptical nodded in quiet agreement. Mayor Thompson raised her gavel. "We'll take a vote," she said. "All in favor of moving the fall festival to an outdoor venue." Hands went up across the room, one after another. The vote was nearly unanimous. The following morning, the town's festival committee scrambled to reorganize the event. The park was chosen as the new venue, and volunteers worked tirelessly to move booths, decorations, and equipment. Tommy helped where he could, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. By midday, the community hall stood empty. Its banners and lights had been taken down, its doors locked. But Tommy couldn't shake the feeling that the building wasn't done with him yet. That night, as rain began to drizzle over Maplewood, Tommy had another dream. This one was more vivid than ever. He stood inside the community hall, watching as the rainwater seeped through the walls, darkening the wood. He heard the groan of the beams and the crack of the foundation. Then, in an instant, the building collapsed, sending debris flying in every direction. Tommy jolted awake, sweat soaking his shirt. His heart raced as he stared at the ceiling, the images from the dream still vivid in his mind. The morning after the festival, as the town cleaned up the park, a low, rumbling sound echoed across Main Street. People turned toward the community hall, their faces filled with confusion and dread. Tommy froze, his blood running cold. Without warning, part of the hall's roof caved in, sending a cloud of dust billowing into the air. The sound of cracking wood and shattering glass filled the streets as the building groaned under its own weight. A section of the eastern wall crumbled, bricks tumbling to the ground in a deafening crash. Gasps and shouts erupted from the townsfolk. Tommy felt his father's hand on his shoulder, pulling him back. Emergency crews arrived within minutes, but the worst had already happened. The community hall stood in ruins, its once proud frame reduced to rubble. As the dust settled, the truth became undeniable. The foundation had indeed been weakened by years of water damage, just as Tommy and Martin had warned. The old beams, once so strong, had finally given way under the strain. In the aftermath, the town rallied around Tommy. People who had doubted him now approached with apologies and gratitude. "You saved us," Mrs. Peterson said, tears streaming down her face. "If we'd been in there." Tommy nodded, his own emotions too tangled to put into words. The collapse of the hall was a wake-up call for Maplewood. The town council launched a full investigation, uncovering years of neglected maintenance and falsified reports. Joe Baxter resigned in disgrace, and stricter building codes were implemented to ensure such negligence could never happen again. Martin Reed was asked to design a new community hall, one that would stand as a testament to the town's resilience and to the boy who had saved it. Rebuilding trust. The morning after the collapse of the community hall, Maplewood awoke to a sense of collective shame mingled with gratitude. Word spread quickly about what had happened and how merrily the town had avoided disaster. People gathered near the ruined structure, their faces pale with disbelief. Some stared at the debris in silence, while others whispered amongst themselves, still trying to process the magnitude of what had occurred. In the days following, the mood in the town shifted. Doubt and division were replaced by a determination to rebuild, not just the hall, but also the trust they had lost in one another. The collapse had revealed fractures in their community far deeper than the cracks in the hall's beams. A town united. Tommy found himself at the center of the town's attention. Neighbors who had previously dismissed him now approached with apologies and praise. "You saved us," said Mrs. Peterson, her voice thick with emotion as she handed him a freshly baked pie. "I'm so sorry I didn't listen." Tommy nodded, still unsure how to respond to the sudden flood of kindness. The same people who had called him the ghost whisperer or dismissed him as a grieving child were now treating him like a hero. It was overwhelming, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he belonged. At an emergency town meeting held in the school gymnasium, Mayor Thompson addressed the gathered crowd. "This tragedy could have been far worse," she said solemnly, "but it wasn't, because one boy refused to give up. Tommy Hawkins saw what we couldn't, and his courage saved lives." The crowd erupted into applause, and Tommy, seated beside his father, felt his face grow hot. Richard placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder, pride evident in his expression. The mayor continued, "We have a long road ahead, but we'll rebuild together. And we'll do it the right way this time, with transparency, accountability, and the input of everyone in our community." The investigation unfolds. The collapse prompted a thorough investigation into the hall's maintenance history. What they uncovered shocked the town. Years of falsified inspection reports and misallocated funds pointed to systemic negligence. Joe Baxter, the town's chief engineer, admitted under questioning that he had been pressured by local officials to sign off on incomplete repairs to save money. His resignation was swift, and he left town in disgrace. Even more disturbing was the revelation that Marcus Fletcher, a contractor who had overseen repairs on the hall decades earlier, had cut corners to pocket extra cash. Old emails and financial records revealed a trail of bribes and cover-ups, implicating multiple parties. The town council vowed to pursue legal action against those responsible. "It's not just about rebuilding the hall," said Councilwoman Martha Stevens at a press conference. "It's about restoring trust in our leadership and ensuring this never happens again." The first steps. The cleanup of the hall's ruins began immediately. Construction crews worked alongside volunteers to clear debris, salvaging what they could. Tommy, now a local hero, was a frequent presence at the site, his junior inspector hard hat perched proudly on his head. Martin Reed, the architect who had first believed in Tommy's warnings, was officially hired to design the new hall. He made it a point to involve the community in every step of the process. "We're not just building a structure," Martin said during the first planning meeting. "We're building a symbol of resilience and unity. This is your hall, and your voices will shape it." Residents of all ages contributed ideas. Some suggested adding a memorial wall to honor the history of the old hall, while others proposed incorporating modern safety features, like reinforced beams and earthquake-resistant foundations. Tommy shyly raised his hand during one of the meetings. "Can we make it so everyone can see how the building is holding up? Like with windows or something?" Martin smiled. "That's a brilliant idea, Tommy. We'll include transparent observation panels so people can monitor the structure over time." The fundraiser. To raise money for the new hall, the town organized a massive fundraiser. The event, held in the park where the Fall Festival had relocated, featured live music, craft booths, and a silent auction. Local businesses donated goods and services, and residents came together to create an atmosphere of hope and celebration. Tommy's drawings of the old hall, along with his diagrams predicting its collapse, were displayed prominently in the center of the event. People gathered around them, murmuring about the boy's uncanny insight. "These are incredible," said Sarah Miller, a local artist. "You captured every detail." The drawings were later auctioned off, with proceeds going directly to the hall's reconstruction fund. To Tommy's astonishment, the highest bid came from a representative of the Vermont Historical Society, who wanted to preserve the drawings as part of the state's history. A new role. As the weeks turned into months, Tommy found himself playing a more active role in the rebuilding process. Mayor Thompson invited him to serve as the youth representative on the newly formed Community Oversight Committee. The committee's mission was to ensure transparency and accountability in all future projects, starting with the new hall. Tommy attended meetings alongside town leaders, taking notes and offering suggestions. Though he was initially nervous, he quickly realized that his voice mattered. During one meeting, the contractor overseeing the foundation expressed concerns about underground stability. Tommy immediately thought of the old structural report he had found and suggested further ground testing. The recommendation uncovered a previously unknown issue with soil compaction, which could have jeopardized the new foundation. "You've got a knack for this, kid," said Mike, the construction foreman, clapping Tommy on the back. "Ever think about becoming an engineer?" Tommy grinned, his confidence growing with each small victory. The groundbreaking ceremony. Nearly a year after the hall's collapse, the town gathered for the groundbreaking ceremony of the new community hall. The sun shone brightly as residents, young and old, filled the park to witness the event. Mayor Thompson stood at the podium, her voice carrying across the crowd. "Today, we turn the page on one of the darkest chapters in our town's history. But we also celebrate the resilience of our community and the courage of a young boy who refused to be silenced." She gestured for Tommy to join her on stage. Nervously, he stepped forward, clutching the small ceremonial trowel he had been given. "Tommy," the mayor said, "it's only fitting that you lay the first stone." With shaking hands, Tommy placed the engraved cornerstone at the foundation site. The inscription read, "Built with courage, guided by truth. Maplewood Community Hall, 2024. The crowd erupted into applause, and Tommy felt a swell of pride unlike anything he had ever known. A new beginning. As construction on the hall continued, Tommy became a fixture at the site. Workers often consulted him, jokingly calling him Inspector Hawkins. Martin Reed gave him a small desk in the site office, complete with blueprints and a notepad. By the time the new hall was completed, it wasn't just a building. It was a testament to the power of persistence, community, and believing in something bigger than yourself. Inside, a small plaque honored Tommy's efforts. "To Tommy Hawkins, whose courage and vision saved us all." The hall opened with a grand celebration, and as Tommy stood in the crowd, surrounded by his friends, family, and neighbors, he realized something important. He wasn't just the boy who had heard a warning. He was part of a community that had learned to listen. Ripple effects. The new community hall became a beacon of Maplewood's resilience, a shining testament to what the town could achieve when united. The sleek design of the building blended modern safety features with respectful nods to its historic predecessor. The transparent observation windows Tommy had suggested were a standout feature, allowing everyone to see the reinforced beams and sturdy foundation that now held the hall. For Tommy, the hall was more than just a building. It was proof that even one voice, no matter how small, could spark change. But what he didn't realize was that the ripples of his actions were spreading far beyond the borders of Maplewood. Recognition beyond Maplewood. Word of the community hall collapse, and Tommy's role in preventing a greater disaster, spread to neighboring towns. Newspapers across Vermont and beyond ran stories about the boy who saved Maplewood, highlighting his persistence and courage. The Vermont Historical Society not only preserved his drawings, but also invited him to speak at a special event honoring young leaders. Standing in front of a crowd in Burlington, Tommy felt his hands tremble as he gripped the microphone. The audience was filled with students, teachers, and local officials, all waiting to hear his story. "I didn't set out to be a hero," Tommy began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I just saw something that didn't feel right, and I couldn't ignore it. At first, nobody believed me, and I wanted to give up. But my mom always said that doing the right thing isn't always easy. It's just always worth it." The audience erupted into applause. Afterward, people lined up to shake his hand, including several other children who said they were inspired by his story. "You made me realize it's okay to speak up," said a boy about Tommy's age, "even if people don't listen at first." A new vision for Maplewood. Back in Maplewood, the changes sparked by the hall's collapse continued to unfold. The town council implemented a long-term safety plan, starting with thorough inspections of all public buildings. They also created a citizens' oversight board to keep the community involved in future projects. Tommy was unanimously voted in as the youngest member. During one of the board meetings, Tommy proposed an idea that caught everyone's attention. "What if we create a program to teach kids about building safety and community responsibility? We could call it something like Future Builders." The idea was met with enthusiastic approval, and within weeks, the program was launched. Local experts, including Martin Reed, volunteered to lead workshops at the school, teaching students everything from basic architecture to the importance of civic engagement. Tommy often participated, sharing his story and encouraging his peers to trust their instincts and speak up when something didn't feel right. The program quickly became a source of pride for the town, attracting attention from neighboring communities eager to replicate its success. Challenges and growth. Not everyone embraced the changes without hesitation. A few residents remained skeptical of the new systems, grumbling about the added oversight and expenses. "This all seems like overkill," muttered George Wilson one afternoon at the coffee shop. "We've managed just fine without all this bureaucracy." Mrs. Linden, who overheard the remark, smiled gently as she poured her tea. "George, we managed fine until we didn't. Change isn't always comfortable, but it's how we grow." Even Tommy faced moments of doubt. Despite the praise and attention, there were days when he wondered if things would ever return to normal. He missed the simplicity of life before the collapse, before every glance from a neighbor carried an unspoken expectation. But every time he stepped into the new hall or watched kids eagerly participate in the Future Builders program, he was reminded of why he had fought so hard in the first place. A hall's first event. When the new community hall opened its doors for its first major event, the Maplewood Winter Gala, the entire town turned out to celebrate. Strings of twinkling lights adorned the building, and the warm glow of its interior spilled out onto the snow-dusted streets. Inside, laughter and music filled the air. Families gathered around long tables laden with homemade dishes. Children danced near the stage, and the hall itself seemed to hum with life. Tommy stood near the observation windows, watching as people admired the building's features. "You should be proud," Martin Reed said, joining him. This hall exists because of you. Tommy smiled. It exists because everyone finally listened. As the evening wore on, the mayor took to the stage to present Tommy with a special plaque. "Tonight, we honor the heart of our community," she said, her voice carrying across the room. Tommy Hawkins reminded us all of the power of truth and courage. And thanks to him, we have a brighter, safer future. The applause was deafening. And as Tommy looked out at the smiling faces, he felt a deep sense of peace. He wasn't just the boy who had heard the warning voice. He was part of something much larger, a community that had learned to work together, a legacy of change. Over the months and years that followed, the lessons of the community hall collapse left a lasting mark on Maplewood. The town became a model for transparency and community engagement, attracting visitors and experts eager to learn from its transformation. Tommy continued to play an active role, not just in the oversight board, but also in mentoring younger kids through the Future Builders program. He found a deep passion for architecture and engineering, inspired by Martin Reed's guidance and his own experiences. By the time Tommy entered high school, he was already designing small projects for the town, from playground structures to park benches. The community had grown to rely on his keen eye and thoughtful approach. Full circle. One crisp autumn morning, several years after the hall's collapse, Tommy stood in the park where it had all begun. The fall festival was in full swing, with booths, games, and music filling the air. The new community hall loomed in the background, its observation windows gleaming in the sunlight. As he watched children run past, laughing and playing, he heard a familiar voice behind him. "You did good, kid." Tommy turned to see Richard, his father, holding 2 cups of cider. He handed one to Tommy, smiling warmly. "Your mom would be so proud." Tommy nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I think she was the one who helped me," he said softly. "The voice I heard, it felt like her." Richard placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Maybe it was, or maybe it was you all along, trusting something bigger than yourself." Tommy looked at the new hall, its sturdy beams and bright windows standing strong against the backdrop of autumn leaves. For the first time in years, he felt completely at peace. The voice, the collapse, the struggle, it had all led to this moment, a future he had helped build. Building a legacy. Years passed, and Maplewood flourished. The new community hall became more than just a building. It was a symbol of trust and collaboration, a place where memories were made and lives were shaped. Tommy Hawkins, once a 10-year-old boy struggling to be heard, grew into a young man whose name was synonymous with courage and vision. But Tommy's journey was far from over. The call beyond Maplewood. At 16, Tommy was invited to speak at a statewide youth summit on leadership and resilience. Held in Vermont's capital, the event brought together young leaders, activists, and innovators from across the state. Standing before an auditorium filled with hundreds of people, Tommy felt a familiar mixture of nerves and determination. "I learned something important when I was just a kid," he began, his voice steady. "Sometimes the truth isn't loud. Sometimes it's a quiet voice, easy to ignore. But listening to that voice, no matter how small, can make all the difference." He shared his story, from the warnings he'd heard about the hall to the struggle of convincing a town to believe him. His honesty resonated with the audience, many of whom approached him afterward to thank him for his words. "You reminded me to trust myself," said a girl about his age, her eyes shining. "Even when others don't." The summit marked the beginning of Tommy's growing influence beyond Maplewood. Invitations poured in from schools, community groups, and even architectural organizations, eager to hear his perspective on safety, resilience, and the power of standing firm in the face of doubt. Dreams take shape. Tommy's experiences fueled a newfound passion for architecture and engineering. He spent countless hours shadowing Martin Reed, who had become both a mentor and a close friend. Under Martin's guidance, Tommy learned to read blueprints, calculate load distributions, and design structures that balanced beauty with strength. For his senior project in high school, Tommy proposed designing a public pavilion for the town park. His idea was simple yet profound: a space where the community could gather, rain or shine, to celebrate, connect, and reflect. The design incorporated elements from the original community hall, including stained glass panels and exposed timber beams. The town rallied behind Tommy's project. Local businesses donated materials and volunteers offered their time and skills. On the day of the pavilion's unveiling, the entire community turned out to celebrate. "You've come a long way," Martin said, clapping Tommy on the back as they admired the finished structure. "This isn't just a pavilion, Tommy. It's a reminder of what we can build when we believe in each other." A college-bound visionary. After graduating high school, Tommy earned a scholarship to the prestigious Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, to study architecture and structural engineering. Leaving Maplewood was bittersweet. The town had shaped him, and every corner held a memory. But he knew that to grow, he needed to see the world beyond its borders. Before he left, the town organized a farewell event at the community hall. Standing in the center of the room, surrounded by familiar faces, Tommy felt the weight of their expectations and their faith in him. "You're going to do great things," Mayor Thompson said during her speech. "But don't forget, Maplewood will always be your home." New challenges, new heights. At MIT, Tommy's talent and determination quickly set him apart. Professors marveled at his creativity and his ability to approach problems with both logic and empathy. He became known for his innovative designs, which often prioritized community involvement and sustainability. During his second year, Tommy worked on a project that brought him full circle, retrofitting aging public buildings to prevent collapses like the one in Maplewood. His designs incorporated affordable solutions for small towns with limited budgets, earning him recognition from industry leaders. But Tommy never forgot his roots. He often referenced Maplewood in his presentations, crediting the town and its people for teaching him the importance of listening to every voice, no matter how small. Returning home. After completing his degree, Tommy surprised everyone by returning to Maplewood instead of accepting offers from prestigious firms in major cities. "I want to give back to the place that gave me everything," he told a reporter from the local paper. Back in Maplewood, Tommy established his own firm, Hawkins Designs, which specialized in community-centered projects. His first major endeavor was redesigning the town's elementary school, which had stood unchanged for decades. He involved students, teachers, and parents in the planning process, ensuring the new building reflected their needs and dreams. The school's opening was a moment of pride for the entire town. "This isn't just a school," said Principal Carter during the ribbon-cutting ceremony. "It's a gift to our children, and their children, from someone who never stopped believing in this community." Inspiring the next generation, Tommy's return brought more than just beautiful buildings. He became a mentor to local youth, running workshops through the Future Builders program he had started years earlier. He encouraged kids to think creatively, to ask questions, and to trust their instincts. One day, a young boy named Ethan approached him after a workshop. "Mr. Hawkins," Ethan said shyly, holding up a sketchbook, "I drew this after the storm last week. Do you think the roof on the library is okay?" Tommy studied the boy's drawings and smiled. "You've got a sharp eye, Ethan. Let's check it out together." Ethan's concern turned out to be valid, and Tommy worked with the town to address the library's structural issues. It was a moment that reminded Tommy of himself and of the importance of fostering courage in others, a hall of truth and resilience. Years later, during the 20th anniversary of the community hall's reconstruction, Tommy stood once again at its entrance. The town had gathered to commemorate the event, and the hall had become more vibrant than ever, hosting everything from weddings to town meetings. Inside, a new addition to the hall was unveiled, a mural painted by local artists depicting the journey from the hall's collapse to its rebirth. At the center of the mural stood a figure of a boy with dark hair, holding a sketchbook, looking up at a building with determination in his eyes. Tommy smiled as he saw it, humbled by how far they had all come. The legacy beyond walls. As Tommy walked home that evening, past the streets he knew so well, he reflected on the legacy he was building, not just in bricks and beams, but in the hearts of the people he had inspired. Maplewood was stronger, safer, and more united than ever, and he knew its future was bright. The voice that had once warned him of danger had been silent for years, but its lesson lingered. Listening, trusting, and acting with courage had brought him, and his town, through their darkest moments. And as he looked up at the stars twinkling above Maplewood, he knew his journey was only just beginning. A vision beyond borders. Tommy Hawkins' name had become synonymous with resilience, innovation, and the power of one voice to ignite change. By the time he turned 30, he was no longer just a local hero. He was a global advocate for safer communities and sustainable architecture. His firm, Hawkins Designs, had expanded its reach, taking on projects across the country and even internationally. But Tommy's heart remained firmly rooted in Maplewood, where it all began. The community hall, rebuilt from the ashes of its collapse, was no longer just a local landmark. It had become a symbol of what could be achieved when a community united behind a shared purpose. People from around the world visited Maplewood to learn its story and draw inspiration for their own challenges. A global call to action. One morning, Tommy received an email that would change the trajectory of his work. It was from the United Nations, inviting him to speak at an international conference on disaster prevention and community resilience. The conference, to be held in Geneva, would bring together architects, engineers, and policymakers to address the growing risks posed by climate change and aging infrastructure. Standing on the stage in a massive auditorium, filled with experts from every corner of the globe, Tommy felt the weight of the moment. But as he began to speak, he remembered the boy he had once been. The boy who had stood alone in front of a town that doubted him. "I come from a small town," Tommy said, his voice steady. "Maplewood isn't a bustling metropolis or a place that makes headlines often. But what happened there carries a lesson for every community, big or small. When we ignore the signs of danger, whether they're cracks in a beam or rising floodwaters, we put lives at risk. And when we dismiss the voices of those who see the danger, we lose the chance to act before it's too late." He shared Maplewood's story, from the voice that warned him to the unity that rebuilt the town. He spoke of the Future Builders program, which had inspired countless young people to take an active role in their communities, and he emphasized the importance of listening, not just to experts, but to anyone with the courage to speak up. The audience gave him a standing ovation, and afterward, delegates from countries as far away as India and Brazil approached him to discuss collaborations. Tommy was invited to consult on projects aimed at retrofitting schools, hospitals, and community centers in vulnerable areas. A new frontier. Tommy's work began to focus on disaster-prone regions, where infrastructure was most at risk. He traveled to coastal towns battered by hurricanes, to villages recovering from earthquakes, and to cities grappling with the effects of rising sea levels. Each place carried its own challenges, but the core lesson remained the same. Safety and resilience required collaboration, transparency, and trust. In a small village in Indonesia, Tommy worked with local builders to design flood-resistant homes using materials readily available in the region. In a drought-stricken part of California, he helped retrofit a historic community center to withstand wildfires. And in the slums of Mumbai, he partnered with NGOs to create affordable, modular housing that could be assembled quickly in emergencies. At each site, Tommy ensured the local community was involved in the process, just as Maplewood had been. "Buildings are for people," he often said, "and people should have a say in how they're built." Returning to Maplewood. Despite his global reach, Tommy returned to Maplewood often. The town had changed in many ways, but its heart remained the same. The community hall now hosted an annual Festival of Resilience, drawing visitors from far and wide. The event showcased Maplewood's journey and featured workshops on safety, sustainability, and community building. One year, the festival honored Tommy with a surprise tribute. As he stood on the stage, looking out at the crowd, He was struck by how far they had all come. "This isn't just my story," he told them. "It's ours. Maplewood taught me that even the smallest voice can make a difference, and I carry that lesson with me everywhere I go." After the speech, a young girl approached him, clutching a notebook filled with sketches. "Mr. Hawkins," she said shyly, "I want to be like you someday. Can I show you my designs?" Tommy knelt to her level, flipping through the pages. Her ideas were creative and full of promise. "These are amazing," he said, smiling. "You're already on your way. Just remember, your voice matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The Hawkins Foundation. Inspired by encounters like this, Tommy founded the Hawkins Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering young architects and engineers. The foundation provided scholarships, mentorship programs, and funding for community-driven projects in underserved areas. One of the foundation's first initiatives was a competition for students to design disaster-resistant community centers. The winning design, submitted by a team of high school students from New Orleans, was built in their city and quickly became a model for similar projects nationwide. Tommy personally mentored many of the foundation's participants, sharing not just technical knowledge, but also the values that had guided him: courage, collaboration, and a commitment to doing what's right, a legacy of listening. As Tommy's influence grew, so did his impact. Policies were changed, new safety standards were adopted, and communities around the world were inspired to take proactive measures. But through it all, Tommy remained grounded. He never forgot the voice that had started it all, the voice that had urged him to speak up when it mattered most. Back in Maplewood, the community hall stood as a reminder of the journey that had begun so many years ago. Its walls bore witness to weddings, celebrations, and moments of quiet reflection. In one corner, a plaque commemorated the boy who had saved it. "To Tommy Hawkins, who taught us to listen. A future built on truth." On a cool autumn evening, Tommy stood outside the hall, watching the sun set over the hills. The air was crisp, and the leaves painted the town in shades of red and gold. Beside him stood his father, now older but just as proud as ever. "You've done good," Tommy, Richard said, his voice filled with emotion. "Your mom would be so proud." Tommy nodded, looking up at the stars beginning to dot the sky. "I hope so," he said, "but I think she's the one who started all this. Her voice. It's what gave me the courage to act." As they stood there, the town around them quiet and peaceful, Tommy felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had built more than buildings. He had built trust, inspired change, and left a legacy that would endure for generations. And he knew with certainty that his journey was far from over. There were still voices to hear, stories to tell, and communities to rebuild. The world, after all, was full of cracks waiting to be mended, and Tommy Hawkins was ready to listen. The global ripple. The sun rose over Maplewood, casting long shadows across the town's familiar streets. Tommy Hawkins, now a man with a reputation that spanned the globe, sat quietly on a bench near the community hall. Though his life had taken him to the farthest corners of the world, Maplewood always remained his anchor, a place where his journey began and where his heart would always return. But today, the world seemed closer than ever. Messages from cities, villages, and communities across continents flooded his inbox, letters of gratitude, questions seeking advice, and updates about projects inspired by his work. The ripple effect of his actions had grown into a wave, reaching places Tommy never imagined. A call from the UN. One of those messages was from the United Nations, inviting Tommy to lead a new global initiative, the Community Resilience Network, CRN. Its mission was ambitious, helping underserved communities worldwide create safer, more sustainable spaces by sharing resources, knowledge, and expertise. At first, Tommy hesitated. Leading such a vast project would require leaving Maplewood more often, and the thought of being away from home weighed on him. But the potential to make a difference on a larger scale was undeniable. After speaking with Martin Reed, his lifelong mentor, Tommy decided to accept the position. "You've always been a builder, Tommy," Martin had said. "Not just of structures, but of connections. The world needs that now more than ever." Building connections across borders. The CRN quickly became a force for change. Under Tommy's leadership, the network connected engineers, architects, and community leaders from every corner of the globe. They shared strategies for building flood-resistant homes in Southeast Asia, earthquake-proof schools in South America, and hurricane-safe hospitals in the Caribbean. One of the CRN's most impactful projects began in a remote village in Kenya, where climate change had made access to clean water increasingly difficult. Tommy visited the village personally, meeting with local leaders to understand their challenges. Together, they designed a system of water collection towers that doubled as community gathering spaces. The project not only solved the village's water crisis, but also brought the people closer together. "What you've done here is remarkable," a local elder told Tommy during the opening ceremony. "You listened to us. Most people come with their own ideas, but you came with your heart." Returning to the roots. While his work with the CRN took him to countless places, Tommy never lost sight of Maplewood. He frequently visited, often surprising the town with impromptu stops at the school or unannounced visits to the community hall. Each time he returned, he brought stories of the communities he'd helped, sharing lessons and inspiration. During one visit, he sat with students at the Future Builders program, listening as they shared their ideas for the town's next big project. A young girl named Ellie presented a sketch of a solar-powered library. "This is brilliant," Tommy said, examining the design. "Let's make it happen." True to his word, he rallied the community to bring Ellie's vision to life. The library became a shining example of renewable energy, complete with a rooftop garden and reading nooks filled with natural light. Ellie, now a teenager, credited Tommy with giving her the confidence to pursue her dreams of becoming an architect. A global emergency. One year, a devastating earthquake struck a densely populated region in Turkey, leaving thousands homeless. The CRN mobilized immediately, sending teams of engineers, architects, and relief workers to assess the damage and plan the recovery effort. Tommy led the charge, coordinating with local officials and international agencies. When he arrived at the scene, the destruction was overwhelming. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble, and survivors huddled in makeshift camps. Yet, amidst the devastation, Tommy saw resilience. He met a young boy, Ahmet, who had lost his home, but was helping others by delivering water and supplies. "You remind me of someone I used to be," Tommy told him, kneeling to meet the boy's eyes. Inspired by Ahmet's determination, Tommy and his team worked tirelessly to design temporary shelters that could be quickly assembled. They involved local residents in the process, ensuring the solutions met their needs. Over time, those shelters evolved into permanent homes, each one a testament to the strength of the community. Recognition and reflection. Tommy's efforts didn't go unnoticed. He received countless awards, including the prestigious Pritzker Prize for Architecture, not just for his designs, but for his philosophy of building with empathy and inclusivity. During his acceptance speech, Tommy reflected on his journey. "I am deeply honored by this recognition," he said, standing on a stage surrounded by the world's most celebrated architects. "But this isn't just about me. Every project I've worked on has been a collaboration, a partnership with the people it was meant to serve. Maplewood taught me that. It taught me to listen." His words resonated with the audience, sparking a shift in the architectural world toward more community-focused practices. The legacy of listening. Years later, the CRN celebrated its 10th anniversary with a special event held in Maplewood's Community Hall. Delegates from around the world attended, each sharing stories of how Tommy's work had touched their lives. A woman from Brazil spoke of a school built in a floodplain that now served as a model for resilience. A man from India shared how Tommy's advice had helped preserve a centuries-old temple while making it safe for visitors. Even Ahmet, now a young architect himself, traveled from Turkey to thank Tommy personally. "This isn't just your legacy," Ahmet said during his speech. "It's ours. You didn't just rebuild our homes. You rebuilt our hope." The next chapter. As the event drew to a close, Tommy stood outside the hall, watching the lanterns the townsfolk released into the night sky. Each light represented a commitment to listening, building, and growing, a reminder of the journey that had started with a whisper in the wind. Standing beside him, Martin Reed broke the silence. "You've done more than build structures, Tommy. You've built bridges between people, places, and ideas." Tommy nodded, feeling both the weight and the joy of those words. The world was still full of challenges, but he knew he wasn't alone. Communities everywhere were stronger, more united, and ready to face the future. As the last lantern disappeared into the stars, Tommy smiled. His journey wasn't over. There were still cracks to mend, voices to amplify, and legacies to shape. But for now, he stood content, knowing that the ripple he'd started in Maplewood had grown into a wave of change that touched the world. And it all began with the courage to listen.